Shut up! I make the rules here!
Naomi Ellison had just driven home after a long business trip when a patrol car suddenly blocked the entrance to her own driveway. Before she could explain that she was the owner of the house, the officer began shouting, ordering her to leave the property at once. When Naomi calmly reached for her phone to call her attorney, the officer lost control and struck her hard across the face in front of her neighbors. 10 minutes later, when his commanding officer stepped out of his vehicle and saw who she was, his face went white in an instant, and nothing on that quiet street would ever look the same again. The afternoon had been golden and quiet, the kind of early autumn light that settled over the wealthy suburb outside Atlanta like a soft haze drifting between the trees. Naomi Ellison guided her sedan down the winding road toward home, exhaustion pressing against her shoulders after 3 days, on a stage discussing judicial reform in front of senators and reporters who had hung on every word she offered. She had shaken hands with governors that week. She had testified before a committee that had once ignored people who looked like her, and had watched, with quiet satisfaction, as several of its members finally began taking notes. Yet tonight, she wanted nothing more than silence, a warm shower, and the familiar creak of her own front door, settling closed behind her. She did not travel with bodyguards. She did not travel with an entourage or a motorcade trailing behind her modest gray car, the same car she had owned for nearly 6 years, despite what her bank account could easily have afforded instead. There were no diamonds catching the light, no designer emblems stitched across her jacket, nothing to announce that the woman behind the wheel had spent 2 decades reshaping how power was held accountable in America. Naomi had always preferred to live quietly, believing that her work should speak louder than her appearance ever could, and for years that philosophy had served her well, allowing her to move through the world largely unnoticed when she wished to be. As her car turned onto the private road leading to her estate, headlights suddenly flared behind her, cutting sharply through the dimming afternoon light. A patrol vehicle surged forward, red and blue lights slicing across the trees, and swerved directly in front of her gate before she could even reach for the small remote control resting on her dashboard. Naomi eased her foot onto the brake, more curious than afraid, assuming there had been some mistake that a few calm words would resolve within a minute or two, the way small misunderstandings usually resolve themselves in a neighborhood like this one. The officer who stepped out was young, perhaps 35, new to the district, and utterly unfamiliar with the woman who lived behind that iron gate. His name was Travis McNeil, and in the 6 months since his transfer, he had built a quiet, unspoken assumption in his mind about who belonged on streets like this one and who did not. He had convinced himself, without ever examining the thought too closely, that estates of this size, with their manicured hedges and stone facades, existed only for wealthy white families who had inherited their money generations earlier. A black woman driving alone toward that gate at dusk did not fit the picture he had built for himself, and his mind rejected the possibility before his mouth had even opened. Travis approached her window, with his hand resting near his belt, his jaw set, his eyes already narrowed with suspicion, before a single word had passed between them. He demanded that she step out of the vehicle immediately, his tone sharp enough to carry down the quiet street. Naomi, still composed despite the sudden intrusion, tried to explain that this was her home, that she lived just beyond the gate, that there was surely a simple misunderstanding they could clear up together if he would only give her a moment to speak. He cut her off before she finished her sentence, his voice rising further, refusing to let her complete a single thought. When she finally stepped out onto the pavement, he looked her up and down with open contempt, as though her calm demeanor were itself an act of defiance he could not tolerate. Naomi reached slowly into her jacket and withdrew her wallet, sliding out her driver's license and offering it without hesitation, her hands steady despite the tension crackling in the air between them. The address printed clearly on the card matched the very house behind the gate, a detail that should have ended the confrontation within seconds under any reasonable set of circumstances. Travis barely glanced at it before tossing the possibility aside in his mind, convinced that people forge documents all the time, convinced that a woman standing before him in plain jeans and a simple jacket could not possibly own a home worth tens of millions of dollars. He handed the license back to her with a dismissive flick of his wrist, as though it meant nothing at all. He asked her, with a sneer curling at the corner of his mouth. Who exactly had sent her here? As though the question itself proved his suspicion correct. Naomi kept her voice level, repeating patiently that she was the homeowner, that her name was on the deed, that she had lived at this address for nearly a decade and had watched these very trees grow tall from saplings. Travis let out a short, disbelieving laugh, the kind of laugh meant to humiliate rather than genuinely question, and glanced around as though searching for someone to share the joke with. A few neighbors, drawn outside by the flashing lights bouncing off their windows, had begun drifting toward their front lawns to watch the scene unfold with folded arms and murmured speculation. None of them recognized her. Despite the countless hours she had spent testifying before Congress, despite the interviews broadcast across national networks discussing reform, despite the changes bearing her name in police departments across several states, not a single person standing on that quiet suburban street could place her face in that moment. One neighbor, arms crossed tightly over a cardigan, murmured to another that she had never once seen this woman before in her life, and the comment rippled through the small crowd like a verdict already decided upon without a trial. The air around Naomi grew heavier with every passing second, thick with unspoken suspicion, dressed carefully in the language of neighborhood concern. Travis straightened his shoulders, emboldened by the small audience gathering behind him, and ordered Naomi to get down on her knees so he could place her in handcuffs without further delay. The words landed in the quiet street like a slap of their own, absurd against the backdrop of manicured lawns and gently swaying trees, yet utterly serious in the officer's narrowed eyes. Naomi felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear exactly, but the familiar, bitter recognition of a scene she had studied for years from the outside, now unfolding around her own body for the very first time in her career. She did not kneel. She simply looked at him, her spine straight, her voice steady as stone, and told him plainly that she was not resisting anything he had asked of her since the moment their exchange began. There was no anger in her tone, only the calm precision of someone who had cross-examined hostile witnesses in courtrooms, far more intimidating than a suburban driveway at dusk. Slowly, deliberately, she reached into her bag for her phone, intending to call the one person who always answered when trouble found her unexpectedly, an attorney on her own legal team who had handled far messier situations than this one. Travis misread the motion instantly, his mind leaping toward the worst possible conclusion available to him. He assumed she was recording him, broadcasting the moment to strangers who might turn it against him later online, and the thought sent a surge of panic through his already agitated nerves. He lunged forward before she could finish dialing, snatching the phone from her hand with a rough, careless yank that nearly knocked her off balance entirely. For one suspended moment, neither of them moved, the phone clattering somewhere on the pavement between them, screen still glowing faintly in the fading light. Then his open palm connected with her face. The sound cracked across the quiet street like a gunshot, sharp and unmistakable, carrying past the hedges and into the open windows of nearby homes where dinner was being prepared. Naomi's head snapped sideways, her hand instinctively rising to her cheek, though she did not stumble and did not fall to the pavement beneath her. The small crowd on the lawns froze entirely, mouths open, phones already rising in stunned, reflexive motion to capture what none of them could quite believe they had just witnessed with their own eyes. One neighbor's device blinked red, recording steadily, the footage already beginning its slow, irreversible journey toward the wider world beyond that street. Naomi turned her head back toward him with unhurried control, her cheek reddening beneath her dark skin, her eyes locking onto his without a single trace of tears forming. She did not scream. She did not collapse into the pleading, frightened posture he had perhaps expected, the posture that might have justified his actions somewhere deep in his own mind. Instead, she simply spoke, her voice low and even, each word landing with the precision of a verdict already written and waiting to be read aloud. "You just made the biggest mistake of your career," she told him, and then she said nothing more, letting the silence that followed do the rest of the work for her. Somewhere behind that calm, unwavering face, decades of memory stirred quietly, though none of it showed on her expression. Naomi had spent her earliest years in a much smaller house, 2 states away, raised by a mother who cleaned office buildings at night, and a father who drove a delivery truck through neighborhoods far less forgiving than this one. She remembered watching her own father questioned on their front step for simply carrying groceries too quickly toward his own door, remembered the particular quiet that settled over her household afterward, a quiet she had sworn, as a young girl, she would one day help dismantle for good. She had built her entire career from that single memory, brick by brick, case by case, until her name carried weight in rooms her parents had never been permitted to enter. None of that history was visible to Travis McNeil as he stood before her, breathing hard, his palms still faintly stinging from the contact. He saw only a woman who had refused to kneel, a woman whose composure unsettled him more than outright resistance ever could have. He did not yet understand that composure itself was a skill Naomi had spent 30 years perfecting, forged in courtrooms where losing her temper for even a single second could cost her clients everything they had left to lose. Word of the confrontation reached the sheriff's office within minutes, though not through Travis himself, who remained entirely convinced he had nothing to fear. A neighbor further down the street, unwilling to become entangled publicly, but unable to stay silent about what she had witnessed, placed a quiet call to dispatch, reporting what appeared to be an unnecessary and excessive use of force against a woman who had shown no sign of resistance whatsoever. The call was brief, almost apologetic in tone, yet it set in motion a chain of events that no one on that street could have possibly predicted that afternoon. Somewhere across the city, a supervisor glanced at his radio screen and frowned, recognizing the address before he had even finished reading the full report. Travis, still standing near his patrol car with his chest puffed out, remained entirely unaware that his actions were already being questioned above his head by people he had never met. He believed, with the stubborn certainty of a man who had never once faced consequences for his instincts, that he had handled a dangerous and uncooperative situation exactly as his training demanded of him. In his mind, the woman before him was the problem, not the open palm that had struck her cheek, not the assumptions that had colored every second of their encounter from the very beginning. He straightened his uniform and waited for backup with something close to quiet pride. Naomi, still holding her stinging cheek with steady fingers, asked calmly to speak with whoever was in charge of the scene unfolding around her. Travis let out another dismissive laugh, waving a hand as though brushing away an insect buzzing near his ear, telling her that threats of authority did not intimidate him in the slightest. He assumed, as he had assumed everything else that afternoon, that she was bluffing, reaching for leverage the way so many people did when caught in a situation, spiraling beyond their control. He could not have been more mistaken, though he had no way of knowing it in that moment. Standing confidently on the pavement he believed he still controlled. While they waited for additional units to arrive, the video captured moments earlier had already begun circulating among the small group of neighbors, passed from phone to phone, with the quiet electricity of something that felt important, something that felt deeply wrong. A second patrol car pulled up along the curb, and a female officer stepped out, her eyes immediately drawn to Naomi's face, the visible mark still blooming faintly along her cheekbone in the low light. Something about the woman's composure, her posture, the shape of her features, struck the officer as unmistakably familiar, though she could not yet place where exactly she had seen her before that evening. The officer, whose name was Deputy Renee Coleman, approached cautiously, glancing between Travis and Naomi with a growing unease she could not quite name or explain to herself. She had sat through department trainings over the past year that featured recorded lectures and printed handbooks, all built around case studies of excessive force and civil rights violations across the country. Somewhere in the back of her memory, a photograph surfaced, a face from a slide deck, a name printed beneath a set of statistics about wrongful detentions and settlement figures. Renee said nothing yet, but her stomach tightened with a quiet, mounting dread that grew heavier with every second she spent studying Naomi's calm, unblinking expression. Renee crouched briefly to retrieve the phone still lying on the pavement, its screen cracked but still functioning, and handed it back to Naomi with an apology murmured under her breath, quiet enough that Travis did not hear it. Naomi accepted it with a small nod, saying nothing, watching the younger deputy's face carefully as recognition slowly assembled itself behind her eyes. It was clear to Naomi that this woman knew something the others did not yet grasp, and that knowledge would matter a great deal within the next several minutes. She waited, patient as ever, for the moment when the truth would finally catch up to the scene around her. A black SUV rounded the corner and rolled to a smooth stop just beyond the gathered patrol cars, its engine humming low before falling completely silent. The door opened, and a broad-shouldered man in a captain's uniform stepped out, his eyes sweeping across the scene with the practiced efficiency of someone who had managed 1,000 chaotic calls long before this one. His gaze landed on Naomi, and for a fraction of a second, his entire body seemed to stop moving entirely, as though the air itself had been knocked clean from his lungs. Recognition crashed over him with the force of a physical blow he had not braced himself for. His name was Captain Roland Mercer, and he had known Naomi Ellison for nearly 15 years, first as a young defense attorney cutting her teeth on wrongful conviction cases that no one else wanted to touch, later as one of the most respected civil rights litigators in the entire southeastern United States. He had sat across from her in mediation rooms during his early years on the force, sweating through negotiations he had once considered unwinnable. He had watched her dismantle flawed department policies with nothing but calm logic and irrefutable evidence, policies that colleagues of his had sworn were untouchable. He had personally sat through the very training program she had authored, the one now required for every officer under his command, including the young man standing just a few feet away, with his arms still crossed in defiant, oblivious confidence. Roland did not spare Travis a single glance as he moved forward. He walked directly past him, past the stunned onlookers gathered along the lawns, past his own stunned deputy standing near the curb, and stopped in front of Naomi with his head bowed low, in an unmistakable gesture of respect and shame. He apologized before she had even asked him to, his voice thick with something between horror and disbelief, his eyes flicking briefly to the faint red mark still visible along her cheek in the dimming light. Every officer standing on that street watched their captain, a man known throughout the department for his steel composure, nearly tremble in front of a woman none of them had recognized only minutes earlier. Roland turned his head sharply, his voice cutting through the stunned silence like a blade drawn from its sheath. "Who touched her?" he demanded, his tone leaving no room whatsoever for hesitation or excuse. Travis blinked, confusion still clouding his expression, unable to understand why his captain's face had drained of all color in the span of a single breath. He opened his mouth to explain that he had simply been following protocol, that the woman had refused a lawful order, that everything he had done fell squarely within department policy as he understood it. Roland turned back toward him slowly, and the look on his face told Travis, in a single wordless instant, that something in his world had just shifted irreversibly beneath his feet. Roland took a steadying breath and addressed the small crowd still gathered along the lawns, his voice carrying the heavy weight of someone forced to correct a grave and very public error. "This," he said, gesturing toward Naomi with something close to reverence, was Naomi Ellison, one of the most influential civil rights attorneys in the entire country, and a woman whose name appeared in law journals studied by officers nationwide. She had won landmark cases against departments that abused their power, cases that had reshaped policy in cities far larger than their own quiet suburb outside Atlanta. She served as a special advisor to the Department of Justice and had co-founded an organization dedicated to monitoring police conduct nationwide, an organization whose recommendations had already changed how thousands of officers were trained across dozens of states. More than that, Roland continued, his voice lowering as the full weight of the moment settled heavily over him. She was the very person who had authored the use of force training program that Travis himself had completed only weeks earlier at the academy. The realization struck Travis like a physical blow, the blood draining from his face as the pieces locked together in his mind with sickening clarity. He had struck, without hesitation or restraint, the woman whose words he had read in a manual, whose case studies he had studied in a classroom, whose entire life's work existed specifically to prevent exactly what he had just done to her. His hands began to tremble, though he tried desperately to hide them behind his back. The neighbors who had watched in silent judgment only minutes earlier now exchanged startled glances, whispers rippling through the small crowd with a very different energy than before. Someone murmured her name aloud, recognition dawning across another face, then another, as fragments of memory surfaced from news broadcasts and magazine profiles they had half-watched years ago on quiet evenings. The video, already circulating quietly among neighbors, began spreading further still. gaining momentum with every passing minute, as the story behind it grew far larger than anyone on that street could have anticipated only an hour before. Within the hour, investigators from the department's Internal Affairs Division arrived at the scene, moving with the brisk efficiency of professionals who understood exactly how quickly a situation like this could spiral beyond containment. They collected everything available to them without delay or hesitation. Body camera footage from both officers was pulled and reviewed in a nearby vehicle. Dashboard camera recordings from the patrol vehicles were secured and logged. Neighbors' phone videos were gathered, cross-referenced, and time-stamped against each other to construct an unbroken chain of exactly what had occurred on that quiet street that evening. Travis, sensing the walls beginning to close in around him with every passing hour, changed his account of events several times within a single afternoon, each version shifting slightly to minimize his own actions in the encounter. First, he claimed Naomi had reached for something threatening inside her jacket pocket. Then he claimed she had physically resisted his attempt to detain her near the vehicle. Each new version crumbled instantly against the footage now assembled before investigators. Footage that showed with painful clarity a composed woman standing still, her hands empty, her voice calm, offering no resistance whatsoever, before the sound of that open palm cracked across the recording. Without warning, reporters began arriving outside the department's headquarters within 2 days, drawn by fragments of the video now circulating widely across news tickers and evening broadcasts throughout the region. A local anchor described the footage as one of the clearest examples of unchecked bias caught on camera in recent memory. Though she was careful, as most of them were, not to editorialize beyond the facts already confirmed. Naomi declined every interview request that arrived at her office that week, choosing instead to let the internal investigation run its course, without her voice adding fuel to a fire already burning brightly enough on its own. Her legal team, however, quietly ensured that every piece of evidence remained preserved, every timestamp verified, every witness account recorded before memories could soften or shift with time. The evidence left no room for interpretation or excuse of any kind. Naomi had never raised her voice throughout the entire encounter. She had never made a threatening gesture toward the officer standing before her. She had presented valid identification within the first 30 seconds of the encounter, identification that matched the address in question exactly, identification that Travis had dismissed without a second glance in his haste to assert control. Internal Affairs suspended him from active duty before the sun had fully set that evening. His badge and weapon surrendered under the watchful eyes of colleagues who, only hours earlier, had regarded him as simply one of their own. Panic set in for Travis almost immediately, the reality of his situation crashing down with a weight he had never once considered possible during his years of training. He had built his entire sense of authority on assumptions he had never bothered to question closely, certainties about who belonged where and who deserved suspicion without cause or evidence. Now those same assumptions threatened to strip him of his career, his reputation, and possibly his freedom, all because he had refused, in one crucial and irreversible moment, to simply listen to the woman standing in front of him. He spent the following days largely alone, his phone silent, except for the occasional message from a former colleague, offering hollow reassurance he no longer believed. He replayed the encounter over and over in his mind, searching for the exact moment where things might have gone differently. Yet every version he imagined ended the same way, with his hand raised and her calm voice cutting through the aftermath. Sleep came slowly and left quickly, and for the first time in his career, Travis McNeil understood what it felt like to be on the other side of an interrogation, waiting for someone else to decide his fate. The formal hearing was scheduled 2 weeks later, held in a courtroom, filled well beyond its usual capacity, cameras from several networks positioned carefully along the back wall to capture every word spoken. Naomi arrived not seeking vengeance, and she made this clear from the very first moment she took her seat at the witness table, her voice calm and deliberate before the assembled panel of officials. She was not there to destroy a young officer's life out of anger, she explained, though she had every right to feel anger after what had happened to her that afternoon. She wanted something far more lasting than a single punishment handed down in a single isolated case. She requested a transparent, thorough investigation into the incident, free from the quiet cover-ups that so often buried cases like hers before they ever reached daylight or public scrutiny. She requested a public apology, not merely offered to herself, but extended to the entire community that had watched an innocent woman struck in her own driveway for the simple crime of existing, where she was assumed not to belong. She requested reform of the department's procedures surrounding stops and identification checks, procedures that had allowed unchecked assumption to override basic verification entirely. And she requested that every officer in the department undergo retraining, this time with renewed emphasis on the very principles that had apparently failed to reach Travis McNeil despite his completed coursework. The hearing was broadcast live across local and national outlets, drawing an audience far beyond what anyone had anticipated for a regional disciplinary case of this size. Naomi spoke without notes, recounting not only her own experience, but the stories of dozens of other individuals she had represented over the years. People who had faced similar treatment without her resources, without her platform, without anyone believing them when they described what had happened to them. She did not raise her voice once during her entire testimony that afternoon. She did not need to, because the simple, unembellished truth carried more weight than any outrage could have possibly managed on its own. The courtroom sat in complete, unbroken silence as she spoke, every word landing with quiet, devastating clarity across the room. She described a young mother she had once represented, stopped 7 times in a single year, on the same short stretch of road for no reason anyone could ever articulate clearly. She described an elderly man, a retired teacher, questioned outside his own home while carrying groceries because a neighbor assumed he did not belong there. She named no one who had not already given her permission, and she offered no case that she could not support with documents, transcripts, and settlements already a matter of public record. Members of the panel, several of whom had entered the hearing skeptical of the attention surrounding the case, found themselves leaning forward, unable to look away from the steady, unwavering woman speaking before them. When her testimony concluded, the panel chairman asked whether she wished to add anything further before the hearing moved toward its findings. Naomi paused for a long moment, glancing briefly toward Travis, who sat pale and rigid beside his attorney at the opposite table. She told the room that she did not hate him, that hatred was not a tool she had ever found useful in her work, but that understanding required accountability first, and always. Forgiveness, she said quietly, could only follow truth. And truth required more than an apology, whispered privately, after the cameras had already gone home. In the weeks that followed, the consequences unfolded with a swiftness that surprised even seasoned observers of similar cases across the country and beyond. Travis McNeil was formally terminated from the department, his personnel file marked permanently with findings of excessive force and conduct unbecoming an officer of the law. Prosecutors began reviewing the case for potential criminal charges, weighing whether his actions rose to the level of assault under state statute, a possibility that loomed over him with mounting certainty as each week passed without resolution. The mayor's office, under intense public pressure from constituents across the city, launched a citywide review of policing practices, examining not just this single incident, but the broader pattern of assumptions that had allowed it to happen in the first place. The department itself underwent sweeping policy changes in the months that followed the hearing, restructuring its verification procedures for property disputes, and mandating far stricter oversight for any physical contact between officers and civilians during routine calls. A new training curriculum was introduced across the entire regional force, built directly upon the framework Naomi herself had developed years earlier, now formally adopted and renamed in recognition of the very case that had exposed its urgent necessity to the public. Officers who had once treated the training as a routine box to check now approached it with a gravity that had been entirely absent from their attitudes before. Deputy Renee Coleman, the young officer who had first recognized something familiar in Naomi's face that evening, requested a private meeting with her weeks after the hearing concluded. She confessed that she had frozen in that moment, uncertain whether to intervene against a superior officer, and she carried that hesitation like a weight she could not easily set down. Naomi listened without judgment, telling her gently that recognizing a wrong and having the courage to name it aloud were two very different skills, and that most people never developed either one. She encouraged Renee to channel that discomfort into something useful, and within the year, Renee had become one of the department's most outspoken advocates for reform from within its own ranks. Some of the neighbors who had stood silently on their lawns that afternoon who had murmured doubts about a woman they did not recognize, began appearing at Naomi's door in the weeks that followed, their expressions heavy with quiet, visible shame. They apologized individually, some through hesitant words offered at her gate, others through handwritten notes slipped beneath her door when they lacked the courage to face her directly in person. Naomi received each apology with grace, choosing forgiveness over resentment, though she made clear, gently but firmly, that forgiveness did not erase what had happened, nor did it mean she had forgotten the isolation she felt, standing alone on that pavement while strangers watched and said nothing. One neighbor in particular, an older man named Harold Whitfield, who had lived on the street for over 20 years, sat with Naomi on her porch for nearly an hour, explaining haltingly how ashamed he felt for assuming the worst about her that day. He admitted that he had never once questioned why he assumed she did not belong, that the thought had simply arrived unbidden and he had trusted it without examination. Naomi told him that this, precisely, was the quiet danger she had spent her entire career trying to address. The assumptions people carried so deeply, they never noticed carrying them at all. Harold left that afternoon with a great deal to think about, and he later became one of the loudest voices in the neighborhood, advocating for the very reforms Naomi had requested. Months passed, and the story that had once dominated headlines slowly faded into something quieter, something folded carefully into the broader record of a system nudged, however imperfectly, toward accountability and change. Naomi returned to her work with the same steady resolve she had always carried, though something in her had shifted permanently, a new depth added to arguments she had once made from theory and research alone. She now spoke, when she chose to, from lived experience as well as legal expertise, and audiences who had once merely respected her now listened with a different kind of attention entirely, leaning forward the way the hearing panel once had. She turned down several offers to write a book about the incident, insisting that her story mattered less than the pattern it revealed, a pattern repeated in cities across the country, far from the cameras and far from the headlines. She continued her work with the Department of Justice, expanding the training program that bore her name into new jurisdictions, eager to avoid becoming the next cautionary headline. She spoke at conferences, testified before committees, and mentored young attorneys entering the field, always careful to remind them that the law was only as good as the people willing to enforce it honestly and consistently. At one such conference, a young law student raised her hand and asked Naomi directly whether she had ever considered, in the days following the incident, simply staying quiet and letting the matter fade without a public hearing. Naomi considered the question carefully before answering, telling the room that silence had always been the easier path, the path most people were quietly pressured to take, and that she understood completely why so many chose it. But she explained that every case she had ever built for a client who lacked her resources had taught her the same lesson repeatedly: that silence protected the system far more effectively than it ever protected the person who had been harmed. She said that speaking out was rarely about anger, and far more often about refusing to let a moment disappear into the same silence that had swallowed so many stories like it before hers. The student thanked her, visibly moved, and later wrote in a class paper that Naomi's answer had shaped the entire direction of her legal career going forward. Stories like this reached Naomi often in the years that followed, arriving through letters, emails, and the occasional stranger who approached her at an airport gate to say a quiet word of thanks. She never grew entirely comfortable with the attention, preferring the quiet satisfaction of watching policy change over the louder satisfaction of recognition, though she accepted both when they arrived unasked. Travis McNeil, for his part, eventually accepted a plea agreement that spared him a lengthy trial, but did not spare him the permanent record now attached to his name. He left the state quietly the following spring, taking a job far removed from law enforcement, in a warehouse 2 states away where no one recognized his face or his history. He rarely spoke of that afternoon to anyone, though those who knew him well noticed a change in him, a hesitation that had not existed before, a reluctance to assume anything about anyone he did not know. Whether that change amounted to genuine growth or simple fear, only he would ever truly know for certain. The organization Naomi had co-founded years earlier saw its membership grow substantially in the months following the hearing, as departments from neighboring states reached out requesting copies of the very training materials that had once been dismissed as unnecessary paperwork. Several of those departments invited Naomi to speak directly to their recruits, and she accepted more of those invitations than her staff had ever seen her accept before, traveling to precincts far smaller and far less funded than the one that had detained her that autumn afternoon. She told each new class of recruits the same story, plainly and without embellishment, not to shame the profession they had chosen, but to remind them precisely what was at stake every time they approached a stranger's door. Several of those recruits later wrote to her personally, describing moments in their own early careers when her words had stopped them from making the very mistake that had once cost her a bruised cheek and Travis McNeil his badge. Captain Roland Mercer, for his part, remained in his position at the department, though the incident had visibly changed the way he carried himself in the months that followed. He instituted mandatory quarterly reviews of every stop involving a private residence, personally signing off on procedures that had once been left entirely to an officer's individual judgment. He never spoke publicly about the guilt he carried over what had happened on his watch. Though those closest to him noticed, he stayed later at the office, read every incident report more carefully, and pushed back harder against colleagues who dismissed complaints too quickly. In quiet moments, he would later admit to Naomi, over coffee, that her case had taught him more in a single afternoon than any seminar had managed to teach him in 15 years of service. One quiet morning, several months after that autumn afternoon, Naomi drove the familiar road toward her home once more, the trees along the street now bare and waiting patiently for winter's arrival. The street was silent, the kind of silence that no longer felt heavy or uncertain, simply peaceful in a way it hadn't quite been in a long while since that evening. A patrol car passed slowly in the opposite direction, driven by an officer she did not recognize, someone new to the force, someone who had likely joined after the policy changes had already taken firm hold across the department. The young officer slowed as he approached her, rolling down his window with an easy, unforced smile, offering a polite greeting before continuing calmly on his way down the street. He did not know who she was. He had no idea that the woman behind the wheel of that modest gray sedan had once been struck in her own driveway, only a short distance from where they now exchanged a simple, courteous nod. He greeted her the way the new protocol required every officer to greet every citizen encountered on patrol, with respect offered freely and without condition, not as a privilege reserved only for those deemed important enough to deserve it. Naomi smiled back at him, something settling quietly in her chest as she watched his car continue down the street and disappear gently around the bend ahead. She turned her gaze toward her own gate, the same iron gate where a hand had once struck her face in front of strangers who hadn't known her name or her history. The metal looked the same as it always had, catching the pale morning light exactly as it had on countless mornings before that day. Yet everything about how she saw it now felt different, layered with a meaning it had never carried before that afternoon in early autumn. She pulled into her driveway slowly, cutting the engine, and sat for a long moment in the quiet cabin of her car, watching the wind move gently through the bare branches overhead. Justice, she had come to understand more deeply than ever before in her long career, did not begin the moment someone in power was finally recognized for who they truly were. It began the moment every person, known or unknown, powerful or powerless, was treated with the basic decency they deserved simply by virtue of being human, long before any name or title ever entered the conversation. That, she thought, stepping out slowly into the cool autumn air, was the only kind of justice worth building toward, and the only kind that would ever truly last beyond a single headline or a single case. She walked up the path toward her front door, pausing briefly to glance back at the quiet street behind her, the same street that had once held her at its mercy, and now simply held her, unremarkably, as one resident among many. The wind stirred the last of the fallen leaves across the driveway, and somewhere down the road, the patrol car's engine faded gently into the distance. Naomi stepped inside her home, closed the door softly behind her, and allowed herself, for the first time in months, to simply exhale.